I'm starting the hall 2, but we also have hall 1. So for online listeners, please choose which hall you're going to be in. Basically, this day will be dedicated to investment for net zero. And I think it's really important that sorry, I just have some minor technical issue. And today's track is going to be moderated by several of our colleagues from University of Oxford. Vlad Mykhnenko is online. Vladlena Martsynkevych from CE Bankwatch, she will be helping us offline. And I hope she will join me in a few moments. But I think we can already start with the first session where we have our moderator, Vlad Mykhnenko, who can also present his research and the research of his colleagues. And I'm happy to launch this second day from this moment. So Vlad, over to you. We'll be fully online for this session. So please take a note that all of the work will be done online, and have a nice session.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr. Thank you very much for inviting us, for organizing this incredibly complicated event, online, in person. I'm personally sorry not to be able to come to Lviv. I've had a very long and still ongoing teaching week with master students in sustainable urban development here at Oxford, and hence could not be in two places at the same time. So having an online session is quite, it's a great idea. So today, in this early morning for us panel, session number 1, we're going to talk about Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, building back better, rebuilding back better, and effectively setting up the scene for the potential future, and presenting some of the research, most recent research that a lot of us have been doing in the UK, in different universities of the UK, and hopefully providing the audiences back at home with some evidence-based focus predictions, plans for the future post-war reconstruction of the country. We've got 3 sort of parts of today's session. We'll start with the kind of setting out the bigger picture for the post-war reconstruction. After that, we're going to move to Dr. Amy Burnett's talk about regenerative futures. I'll present the speaker when she comes in for the second part, and then depending on how fast, how slow we continue, we'll have a third part in which I'll give a brief overview of one increasingly intriguing opportunity for one particular type of industry in Ukraine, which is iron and steel sector, and for the big study that we've done on how iron and steel sector can be rebuilt without the use of fossil fuel. So it's a green steel presentation as a final part of today's session. After each of the talks, we'll have a conversation with you online and in Lviv, so that to break up obviously the flow a little bit, and that's always better for us, especially people who are tuning in online, to have a bit more interaction. So I'll start with the first bit. My name is Professor Vlad Mykhnenko. I'm a professor of geography and political economy at the University of Oxford. I'm working at the Sustainable Urban Development program. We teach masters and postgraduate students in sustainable urban development and supervise doctoral projects. And for a number of period of years now, I've been doing some research on how previous war experiences, especially Second World War, can inform Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. So for this first part, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the context, although, of course, for this audience, I don't need to explain much what's going on, given that you're suffering continuous bombardment, and it's obviously incredibly difficult for all of us. I'll talk about some of the sort of scientific techniques that can be used to plan post-war reconstruction, and then I'll show you what the figures actually, what the analysis of the Ukrainian post-war reconstruction look like on the basis of the information that we have. There is a lot of ambiguity and there's a lot of, obviously, gray areas in terms of statistics. The National Statistics Office have stopped particular time series in 2021. So now we are 4 years of lacking 4 years worth of good stats on certain industrial activities for strategic reasons, I presume. But at the same time, I think with all available information, there is still a chance for us to forecast and look at the future and see what a potential reconstruction of Ukraine will look like. So as most of us know, during the war, Ukrainian government, World Bank, European Commission, and the UN have been running these rapid damage and needs assessment exercises, trying to effectively catalog the amount of damage that happened to Ukraine since the 24th of February 2022. And these are annual exercises, and the most recent one was published the 1st of January 2025, so about 8 months ago. And according to this analysis done by these institutions, governmental agencies, Ukraine's economic loss, disruption to economic flows of production, additional cost and wage, and the whole sort of economic loss from the war amounted to $589 billion US. According to this analysis, the reconstruction and recovery needs of Ukraine were about $524 billion, almost 3 times the size of the Ukrainian economy. And for our purposes, the most important figure for me, at least, is that the direct damage of housing, energy, extractive industries, transport, commerce, agriculture sector, direct damage to the buildings and infrastructure amounted to $176 billion. So we got some figures now that allow us to plan, at least to understand the extent of the damage. The figures, the official figures, are very close to the figures that the Ukraine leading private institution, research institution, Kyiv School of Economics provides. The World Bank's rapid needs assessment and the Kyiv School of Economics assessment is kind of aligned quite well. And you can see from this slide that obviously every research rapid needs and recovery assessment, the figure of direct damage and the figure of obviously reconstruction is suddenly grows and grows and grows, and inevitably the next exercise probably will be published in January next year will give us an even higher figure and much higher figure, given that this year has been particularly horrible for Ukrainians, given that the invading forces have been destroying even more productive infrastructure, electricity grids, etc., etc. So the figure for the end of this year will be probably much bigger than today's. But the figure we will have is the figure we're going to work with. And I'm particularly going to focus on the 176 billion of the direct damage figure. So why we need this? We have a particular intriguing technique that was developed by Vasily Leontiev, who had a Ukrainian connection because he was studying in Kharkiv before escaping to Bolsheviks to the US. A Russian origin American economist who was in fact the first Nobel Prize winner in economics. And his greatest idea was to develop a particular technique for predicting future economic output on the basis of the current trends, which is called input-output analysis. And his PhD dissertation, published in 1939 at Harvard University, effectively predicted that the US would be lacking quite a lot of iron and steel production for the needs of the upcoming Second World War. So he predicted that US will run out of steel for the needs of the front. And that was a very useful prediction because according to the normal analysis at the time, they were expected to have surplus of steel, which of course was absolutely necessary for tank production. So the input-output analysis has a direct link with the war itself, and effectively it has saved our bacon back in Second World War, and I will show you how we can use that also, hopefully, to see what Ukraine's future will look like using the analysis. So Vasily Leontief has popularized his technique from the time of his PhD thesis, The Structure of American Economy, was published in 1941 by Harvard University Press, and since then, from that period of time, over the last 60 years and so on, the methods become quite popular. You can see a number of quite important contributions by Vasily Leontief himself, but also by other people who picked up his method of analysis. And some of the most recent books you can see were published in 2005, 2009, and we're going to try to use that to see how Ukraine's post-war reconstruction will look like. Back in the day, these people struggled with statistics because statistical offices at the time did not have enough data for the academics to work with. But over time, more and more statistical agencies nationally, but also internationally, the European Commission, the European Statistical Agency, for example, obviously the UK National Statistical Office, but also some subnational or national governments across various places like Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. You see UN has been doing some statistical collection for the method itself. Chinese colleagues have been doing that for the People's Republic of China. And Ukrainian Statistical Office has also started to produce enough data for us to analyze over the last 10 to 15 years. So there is quite a nice sound statistical basis for some analysis for a lot of countries, and also including Ukraine. The method itself is based on quite a complicated matrix algebra calculations, which Vasily Leontief obviously invented back in the day. But now we have a much easier options of dealing with it, which is why I've kind of invested time to develop and learn about this technique. I'll give you a brief overview of the thing itself so that you understand and perhaps understand how far it goes. And the example comes from the Statistical Agency of Singapore. And to understand how the input-output modeling works, it takes the example of a Singaporean computer industry and run through example of, just imagine, computer industry receives an order for 1 million of extra computers, right? What happens to the economy of Singapore if you have this extra demand for particular products, say PCs or laptops? So $1 million comes into Singaporean economy, and obviously $1 million for computers need to coincide with 1 million worth of computers being produced. So there is a direct effect to the economy when a new demand comes in. So 1 million comes in. To produce $1 million worth of computers, however, the industry itself needs to buy a few other things. And in Singaporean case, they need to buy $300,000 worth of drives, of these drives. Then they need to buy some circuit boards, some chips, 90,000 worth of, and subsequent rounds of producing the chips, the drives, also generates about 50,000 worth of extra economic output. This is the indirect effect from the direct effect on 1 million purchase of computers. The workers working for the extra computers to be produced, of course, are getting extra pay, either because they're given overtime pay or because they're working long hours. So the workers themselves are having more money coming in because they're producing more. And hence, the workers tend to spend that money, or at least some of that money as well. So in Singaporean case, the workers working to produce 1 million worth of extra computers will get about $160,000 extra spending to spend on the things that they want to buy. And that also creates an extra demand for things that people like, haircuts, cinema tickets, restaurant bills, etc. So $1 million coming into Singaporean economy to buy $1 million worth of computers, in this case, produces about $440,000 of extra effects, plus a bit of consumption effect, and overall, the total output that the Singaporean economy have to churn to produce 1 million worth of computers is 1,600,000. So the multiplier for the industry is 1.6. $1 of extra demand will generate $1.6 of total output in Singaporean economy. So multiplier effect is that number that comes, you can see it on the screen as well. Now, we can do a simple analysis also of all Ukrainian sectors. And this is what I've done to analyze each Ukrainian industry and how much multiplier effect each Ukrainian industry has for the economy as a whole. And I'm taking here construction as the main example, because of course construction industry will be the industry that will be generating the extra output, i.e. rebuilding bridges, factories, buildings, hospitals, and on and on and on. So there's a lot of reconstruction effort will be going through the construction industry itself that should have to obviously produce all of that output. And you can see the figures on the right in yellow are the figures of the multiplier effect of the Ukrainian construction industry. I put the 2014 figures, I put the 2021 figures. 2021 figures are the latest that we have, because the statistical agency of Ukraine stopped doing that, because obviously the enemy can also calculate everything as well and understand what to hit harder to stop the economy going. So these figures from 2021, I presume, are very confidential and private. We're using the pre-war, the latest pre-war figures. And you can see that for output, for example, the construction industry total multiplier is 4.65. So for 1 Ukrainian hryvnia invested in the construction industry, the economy overall will have to generate 4.65 hryvnia of total output. Here, it doesn't really matter hryvnia dollar, because this is figures that work both ways. Also, the construction industry has a very high income multiplier, meaning that the income generated by the workers will be spent also quite significantly. For $1 of it, you'll get 6. And an output multiplier, the economic growth multiplier, which is gross value added, the GVA, is also very high. And indeed, Ukrainian construction industry is amongst top 3 for output, top 6 for income, and top 7 for economic growth. So it's one of the most linked up industries in the country. And hence, post-reconstruction through the construction industry will churn quite a lot of output, inevitably. So now we have Excel spreadsheets. We don't need to calculate matrix algebra crazily as Vasily Leontiev had to do. And after a few calculations, we can get kind of the picture of the whole economy per year of investment for post-war reconstruction. What I've done, I've taken the total figure of needs today of the damage that happened, $176 billion. I've divided it by 10 years because I think 10-year post-war reconstruction period is what World Bank is looking at. And so just imagine that 1/10 of that big sum, which is, let's say almost $17 billion, are coming to the Ukrainian construction industry as a demand for new buildings, for reconstruction. And you can see in the spreadsheet all these numbers. It's effectively the system, the matrix shows us which industry will have to produce how much to satisfy that demand. There are 5 top kind of winners of this. The codes are the classification codes of industry according to the statistical offices, internationally, in fact, classifications of industrial activities, wholesale and retail trade, repair motor vehicles and motorcycles. That big industrial chunk, that big services industry is the first winner, is the highest winner of construction and post-war reconstruction. The second largest affected industry will be other non-metallic mineral products. The third one will be basic metals, followed by electricity, gas, steam, air conditioning supply, and followed by land transport, water transport, air transport, warehousing, and transport support. So the post-war reconstruction will generate enormous amount of extra output from those 5, from many other industries, but those top 5 industries are the most highly affected in a good way. So we know this, and this is quite solid. There's quite solid statistical basis for that. Now, over 10 years, what will happen? What will happen over 10 years? So if we take that $176 billion will be spent over 10 years just to rebuild stuff that's been destroyed. Just reconstructing and rebuilding things will generate an extra 13% of economic growth for each year of the post-war reconstruction period. And that means we're talking about an extra $273 billion of GDP over a 10-year period of time. Ukrainian economy before the war was 200 billion. So we're adding 273 billion on top of the 200 billion, meaning that eventually we're going to double and more than double the size of the economy after the post-war reconstruction. The GDP per head figures are difficult because we don't know how many people we'll have. But if we take the pre-war figures of the current figures of 31 million people living in Ukraine, at the moment according to the IMF, we are looking at doubling the GDP per head to almost $15,000 by 2035. Now, of course, you remember there is also other economy, not just the construction industry that will continue working, right? There are all the other things people do now without doing reconstruction, all the agriculture work, farming, manufacturing, defense, etc., etc. So there are all the other economic activity that will obviously continue, and the IMF forecast for the next 5 years is about 4% a year on average. So you will have the normal economy working at potentially 4% a year. Then you have 13% of extra post-reconstruction related output. So actually, we may reach an economy that will be the size, quite a significant size of 670 billion in 10 years' time. And that pushes our per capita levels to almost $20,000 per head. Of course, there is also other potential inputs into the economy, and here we are obviously approaching a really wild scenarios, but it's not entirely unlikely that over 10 years of post-war reconstruction, if it's done appropriately, we may not reach an even bigger size of the economy, reaching our Western neighbors' levels of GDP per head, Bulgarian, Romanian, Hungarian, maybe even Polish levels of GDP per head. So this is, quite significant, obviously message. We've put that message into the white paper that Professor Henrietta Moore and Arthur Kay at UCL has produced, called "Building Bridges for Ukraine: Pathways to Sustainable Prosperity," and that white paper has been presented at the latest Ukraine Recovery Conference in Rome in July, which is the annual gathering of governments and activists to think about how the recovery will take place. So we are currently popularizing, sharing this knowledge of how the Ukrainian post-war economy could look like. And I think the main message is that the overall future is I would say is really bright. And that I think leaves us with some optimism and hope. And I'm really glad that I'm able here to show this data with you. So I'm going to stop for now and open the floor for questions, discussions, comments, reflections, which I'll try to moderate from here, and also we have moderator there as well.
Thank you so much, Vlad. Будь ласка, якщо у когось є питання, я можу допомогти в аудиторії. Можливо, do we have any questions as well in Zoom? No? Maybe I will start with the question. So Vlad, did you have a look also on the economic effect of the localization of everything and how important it will be for our economy eventually?
Yes. So I'll put the map on, the current map of the war, because I think it's easier for us to kind of think about the space in that terms. Obviously, things are happening every day, and firms and businesses have relocated in different places. We have some news, we have some understanding of where firms moved to. A lot of the activities are quite sensitive, like the defense sector is very sensitive, quite big, but obviously those activities needs to be hidden. So we don't. I don't really know exactly where most of the activities have relocated. We hear that a lot of companies move to Lviv, a lot of companies move to Uzhhorod, right? A lot of companies move west, as further away from the front, and probably those firms might stay there for the duration of the war itself. But I think the main message for me would be from me would be to look at the examples of all the other Eastern European countries that entered the EU over the last 10, 15 years. What happened is that the gravity, the economic gravity, shifts towards the European Union borders, or towards the more westernmost part of the European Union. So in most of the countries that you know of, the activity, the kind of the gravity pull moved further to the western borders of those countries. Yeah, to Wroclaw, not to Lublin. Yeah, to Timisoara and not to Constanța and Galați. So one would expect that with the EU entry and the post-war reconstruction, quite a lot of activity will move to sort of western parts of Ukraine, because this is the closest to the EU border. So I think we can definitely predict that process to be happening after the war, and I presume this is already happening now.
I saw maybe the question was also in Zoom. I guess you can read it, please.
Is the predicted growth dependent on external international input to the economy? So that's a good question, Hago. The system, the input-output model works on the domestic side of the economy. So it looked at the domestic economy producing goods and buying goods from each other, and then the export and import bits come as an extra layer. So actually, the focus is dependent on the economy being able to absorb the money and absorb this additional demand. And one important part of this, which we don't really know about, is labor. So obviously, producing all these reconstruction needs, covering all these reconstruction needs, will require a number of extra workers, construction workers in particular, right? We had the construction industry before the war at a particular size, and the $17 billion of extra demand will only be half of what the Ukrainian construction industry could produce in 2021. But of course, we don't really know at the moment how small or big the construction industry itself is, and how many people are left in it, and how people left it. So one important caveat that I need to add is, of course, labor force needs. And that is the most difficult to assess, because, of course, Ukraine hasn't had a general population census since 2001. So the last 24 years, we're kind of working at very, very approximate levels of population. And also we are working at quite approximate levels of workforce. So the workforce is the biggest question mark, I think, for me. And I think that is incredibly useful for us to start thinking about that. There'll be a lot of jobs in Ukraine, massive amount of jobs, which I hope, of course, will attract people to return. But of course, this is slightly difficult to predict.
Thank you. And we have a question from the audience.
Так, пане Владе, я хотіла запитати, ви зараз озвучили дуже колосальні цифри відновлення України. Всім відомо, що є дуже велика проблема
of recovery of Ukraine, and we know that there is a big problem with the labor force. You have just mentioned it. How do you estimate how can Ukraine resolve these problems? Because a lot of people left Ukraine. How can we do it? How can we cope with it? What Ukraine can do? Because right now we have a problem with labor force, and within the time it may be even worse. Well, this is the most urgent issue. From the one side and from the other side, it's not clear because we don't have enough information about labor force. So from the one side, post-war recovery and peace or ceasefire that will come to Ukraine. And that will mean that most Western governments will start to cancel programs for Ukrainian refugees, and they will motivate Ukrainians to come back to Ukraine, because we need to remember that Western governments have legal basis to leave Ukrainians or not, legal right. So it doesn't depend on the Ukrainians living in France or Germany, but it depends on the governments of those countries. So if you know the public situation in Europe, there are big anti-migration tendencies, and I believe that most governments will motivate Ukrainians to come back to Ukraine. That will lead to many tragic stories, but we can't say that Ukrainians will stay in the West just because they want. They may not be allowed to do it. So some portion of Ukrainians will have to come back. So I don't think that these scenarios that 90% of Ukrainians will live abroad too pessimistic. I think that the Western governments will start to encourage them to come back to Ukraine. So the Ukrainian government envisaged 4.5 million jobs for Ukrainians. This is a big amount of people we need for recovery. But as you can see, these figures are biggest, tremendous, and that will lead to the rising of salary. So the salary will be much bigger than right now. And I think that it is another good incentive for the Ukrainians to come back, because the salary will grow very very quickly and very soon. But this is what I can say right now according to the estimates we have. Thank you very much. We have another question from the audience. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm impressed. So just a small remark regarding to the lack of labor force. I believe that this is a big effect. I mean, multiply effect according to the Leontief's model, and even for the post-war Germany and Korea, we see how the labor force affects the multipliers effect. So I have a question. Did you calculate the threshold? So how much should be invested into the... And the second question, for me, it's very important. What institutional and political prerequisite must be in Ukraine to encourage this growth, so that it could be stable economic growth? What does the government do to ensure this multiplied effect? So that's a great questions, two big questions. So from the one side, so one of the biggest problem, if the economy is able to absorb this amount of money, if the Ukrainian government could spend this money efficiently. We remember Stefan Ayem, who was minister. He said that they wasn't able to absorb over 5 billion, and we are talking right now about the figures that are 3 times bigger. So the question is if the Ukrainian government can use this money correctly and efficiently. So this is the big question. As I said before war, the Ukrainian building sector produced 2 times than 17 billion dollars. They produced for $37 billion. So post-war, pre-war industry was able to absorb it very easily. Right now, it's another story, and planning for 10 years is quite efficiently, but I think that this process can take over 10 years because people are coming back slowly, as you said. We need extra money to ensure retraining of these people. So it's not like operating a tractor. So the second challenge for the Ukrainian government is to govern labor force, retraining, and because the economic demands will be big.
The third issue is corruption. You are talking about billions. Naturally, it is question number 1 at any Western conference. This is in the hands of Ukrainian society. Thank you. I don't see any questions, so we can move to the next. So we can
let's move on to our second part of today's morning session, and I'm here to welcome Dr. Amy Burnett from the Center for Enterprise, Environment and Development Research at Middlesex University in the UK. And Amy has done quite a lot of work on post-war reconstruction in a variety of conflicts, interests, including Bosnia, and I think quite a lot of experience that she has gathered and quite a lot of knowledge that she has accumulated over this time will be quite useful for us thinking about the Ukrainian context and learning lessons from other places that has suffered wars and also had to be reconstructed afterwards. So I'll pass to Amy the floor, and really looking forward to her contribution.
Thank you very much, everybody. Can you just check that you can see that?
I can see and hear it.
Okay. I hope you're ready for a very colourful presentation today. Yeah, so I think it's absolutely a fantastic segue from what Vlad's just spoken about to some of the ideas that I want to talk to you about. So I've always been fascinated about the word regeneration. And I know it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment. It's quite popular, but in a way that's a good thing because there's lots of discussion around what does that actually mean in terms of positive systems in our society. So my background is I'm an academic, but I've also done lots of work working in communities in the global south on decentralization projects, post-war reconstruction projects as well. So I've worked in Angola, I've visited lots of post-war African countries as well. So I do understand very deeply the challenges that face Ukraine as it seeks to build back. So I just wanted to use this presentation as an opportunity to kind of think critically about what does build back mean. And what does it mean in terms of the opportunities to move towards regenerative post-war systems? So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Just check. Yeah, so in terms of what we're going to talk about, I just wanted to kind of very briefly look at, some of the challenges that we all know that Ukraine is facing, and then thinking about the distinction between building back and bouncing back and regenerative futures, thinking about how value sits within these discussions. So what is being valued, what is being considered, measured, and what impact does that have on how we finance the future? Thinking about the pillars of regenerative reconstruction, and then some kind of concluding remarks about the way forward, particularly around how finance can embed regenerative value and perspectives, so that there is positive reinforcing of positive tipping points rather than building back what, maybe is an opportunity to kind of think differently about things. So I don't need to tell you about, the impacts that you're facing, but there are multiple interlocking impacts as a result of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. That might be related to infrastructure. We talked about jobs in the labour force and the fact that lots of people have left. And that's also having a massive impact on nature and the environment as well. This is an opportunity to discuss positive futures. So that's what we're going to kind of look at, how you can kind of think beyond the negative and move towards positive things. So this is based on some analysis that I did as part of a recent policy innovation fellowship that I did government in the UK. And I was looking to move to another, from a state of disadvantage to a state of, true empowerment and resilience and beyond. And so you can kind of think about understanding, what is disadvantaged in terms of the built environment, institutions, the opportunity and the potential for people to seize opportunities, create opportunities, people's physical capacities, people's emotional and mental capacities, what stage they are in their life, how their family and friendship networks are affected, and also their self-belief. So there are lots of different ways to kind of not only look at the infrastructure and the financing, but there's a whole range of societal issues that need to be considered when we think about the systems that we want to kind of think about how this can be an opportunity to think differently about aid, rebuilding societal systems, thinking about recovery and reconstruction, because in some cases, particularly in some previous post-war reconstruction, there is a kind of tendency to kind of maybe want to replace what was lost. There's been some kind of extractive value in terms of it's not necessarily creating the conditions to flourish, because it's quite top down. So what we need to kind of think about is how to kind of create regenerative recovery. So creating the circular and positive feedback loops. And I know there's been some financing that's gone into kind of supporting circular economies through this process as well. Thinking about the multiplier effect that Vlad's just talked about, community-led solutions and the role of communities. In England, we're calling them the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, which may be a term that you're familiar with, but I can talk to you more about that. And as well as net zero, one of the research projects that we're working in at CEDA, the Centre of Enterprise Environment Development Research at Middlesex University, is looking at how we can build in nature positive into our economies and our decision making and thinking about investment. So there's been lots of focus on net zero, but actually we need to also include nature as well as these wider societal benefits. So there's a big kind of as I said, system-wide thinking in terms of the environment, net zero, nature, and all sorts of things. So but there's also lots of wonderful examples of regenerative frameworks that are being actively constructed at the moment. So they could be used as a kind of means to pioneer new reconstruction approaches in Ukraine and beyond.
I mean, could you speak a little bit slower?
Yeah, for the sake of translation as well.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, sure. So there's been some academic work, mainly around in the University of Exeter, but also other places of increasingly paying attention to the idea of tipping points. And it's like, how do you kind of create something so that it is positively reinforcing a desired outcome rather than being kind of like a negative spiral? So there are kind of ways that we can think about how to create positive tipping points. And for instance, I don't want to focus on the negative, but the positive feedback loop. So, you know, how can we use green reconstruction to enhance skills, local employment, reinvestment? How can we use rebuilding of, well, not rebuilding, but supporting ecosystem health towards you know, a framework for supporting prosperity? So there's lots of different ways that we can think how the interdependent benefits of what we're trying to do can be reinforced by appropriate incentives and program and financing design. So that's what I want to talk to you about now, is how can we build back better through community-centered, ecologically restorative recovery. And just very briefly, there's some research that we've been doing at CEDA, which is very, very much related to this area. We've been looking at value in the voluntary community social enterprise sector, how social enterprises can support health services and food systems, how you can create citywide community wealth building, and also thinking about the well-being economy. So we've got lots of research that we've done in this area that adds value to what I'm going to talk about. In terms of regenerative value, this is it's not a term that I coined, but I think it's a term that is very, very important to think about as a definition of what does it actually mean and how can this particular value be embedded into the systems that we want to create going forward. So I've defined regenerative value as when it's other forms of capital are used in sustainable ways, creating positive reinforcement of multiple social, environmental, and economic benefits. And there are various ways that you could potentially use that in the pillars of regenerative reconstruction. So you kind of would look at each pillar as something that's constantly reinforcing the other so that you can move towards a kind of restorative state. So that might be through local procurement positions. So how does what you buy leave a positive environmental and social impact or on infrastructure? Thinking about cooperative models of ownership and democratic ways of doing things, skills development, etc. So there are lots of different ways that we can think about how, when we make a decision, does it try and work towards all of these simultaneously. But it's really important to think about doing this with purpose and being able to understand that there are lots of complexities behind it. I mean, some of the questions that were just asked about the labour force and the fact that there have been lots of people who've left, you know, these are kind of critical questions that are a reality check in terms of how to actually achieve this. So one of the things is like being able to kind of critically think and reflect regeneratively as a person and as a group as well, with who you're working with. So it's about governance, and it's almost like a kind of a way that it's a mindset to be able to kind of think like this. So that in itself will take skills and work as well. Being able to measure regeneratively, that means you have to have the right indicators, you have to have the right frameworks, you have to have comparative value measures as well, and commitment to measure and incentivize this. And it's really important as well to think about when people want to incentivize regeneratively, it's not just about money. Often it's about people's time, it's about reciprocity, it's about understanding and giving, it's about sharing essentially. So it's how can you embed that and incentivize that in new and innovative ways. And also, there's so many wonderful examples in the UK, across the world, in Ukraine as well, about positive systems that work. So it's about scaling them. It's about understanding that local context matters and that they're not necessarily going to be scaled in the same way. So, including the rural, I'm very interested in rural issues in the UK, and they hold their own challenges, but also they've got a real opportunity to kind of think about what does it mean to be prosperous in a rural context as well. So this is from a book chapter that I wrote in 2022. It's quite a simple diagram, but it just kind of shows all the different multiple dimensions of value that you might consider when thinking about what does it mean to value something. And what I think is important is that we try and find a way to understand how these values interact, and then how they can also create a kind of quantifiable regenerative value score, if you like, and that could be used to understand how and to what extent we are moving towards desired states, and then thinking about how we align our governance and our financing so that we can create more positive outcomes. So it's quite complementary to donut economic thinking and the idea of planetary ceilings. And I'm sure you're very aware of the donut economics model, where we have thresholds that we are going to exceed if we don't live within planetary limits, and we have to work within them. So that's essentially what I'm fascinated with, which is how do you measure value so that you live within planetary living limits, but also that you can express this as a kind of a measure through which you can show that you're progressing and incentivize others to do the same. I'm not going to go through this in any detail because it's got quite a lot of information, but this will be recorded and you can look at it in slower time. And also, I'm sure my presentation will be shared. But this is something that I've been looking at with in my policy innovation fellowship funded by the British Academy on the role of the voluntary community and social enterprise sector related to the question of what is its value, what is the value of the voluntary community social enterprise sector. And so in terms of thinking about how you might value that, there are lots of different ways that you can understand value, including different lenses that you're trying to look at it from, and then also a kind of, well, what's your main question that you're trying to answer by looking at it from this particular perspective. So I also looked at a whole load of frameworks and indicators, and there are kind of strengths and weaknesses in terms of understanding value from different perspectives. Some are well developed, some are underdeveloped, and there's opportunities to really start to measure and understand value a lot deeper so that we can better understand like how we're going to work towards what we need to. So this is this could be updated to the Ukrainian context or any context, but essentially it's an idea about how you can positively encourage purposeful value chains. So essentially, it's if you kind of look at the regulatory voluntary measures on the left, that is looking at how you can kind of set legislation policy so that you can have positive carrots or sticks to make people kind of potentially act more sustainably or not. So that might be a taxation on something that's unsustainable, or carbon taxes, etc. There's lots of debates on those, but just as a principle, that's the kind of the regulatory route. And then also you can have like a reward system. So that might be through an eco coin or some kind of, maybe some places use local currencies or ecosystem service payments to farmers and landowners. There's lots of mechanisms that allow you to be rewarded for acting in a kind of sustainable way that could be embedded into wider financing and recovery solutions. There's obviously like financial measures that you can quantify in terms of regenerative value, but there's also social measures. So how much time and skills and human capacity? Is it time banking where you share information, you share somebody's time with somebody else? So there's the financial and the non-financial, and I think that's really critical because often we value what is financially rewarding and we don't value the social aspects of it. So in terms of thinking about, you know, where there are communities that might have been particularly affected by a war, how can you start to think about the non-financial value of something to, you know, create ways that you can actually reward positive action as well. And then essentially, I know that we're probably going to be short on time soon, but these other boxes are basically trying to just say that if you had comparable indicators that you could compare in different places, recognizing that there is local difference, that you can basically start to integrate these indicators in a way that incentivizes change at scale, and that you can bank financial and non-financial value in a community savings bank, for instance, that could be used to then access new funding and incentivize further change. So that's basically what that's about. I appreciate it probably looks a bit complicated, but it just kind of, it's just one example of how you could kind of put together a schematic on how this could work. Vlad, how much time have I got left?
I think you're okay on time. You can.
Okay, great. Cool. So in terms of thinking about what these positive loops look like, so there's a lot of support. We do lots of work on SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises. In the UK, nearly over 99% of businesses are SMEs, which is basically a business that has got less than 249 employees. So, you know, they are really critical to the UK economy and for Ukrainian the economy as well, to kind of think about how you can kind of work to support the smaller businesses as well, so that they can really kind of start to support community recovery and economic recovery as well. So, you know, what in particular can be done for those businesses, because often they are very much rooted and tied to their communities and the value chains in them. Anchor institutions like universities, hospitals, are key economic catalysts for local development. So obviously there'll be lots of partnerships working with them, but there is an increasing role that we're seeing in the UK for universities to catalyse entrepreneurial initiatives as well. So I think in terms of supporting anchor institutions like these, so an anchor institution is a large organisation that employs lots of people in a particular area. So, you know, working with them to think about how to think regeneratively is a real opportunity as well. We've talked about workforce development, how that requires you know, training in green skills, economic literacy, regenerative techniques and regenerative thinking. As I said, sometimes it's a bit of a mindset shift in terms of thinking in a different way. And so that does require workforce development in that area. So thinking about local environmental bonds as well. So I mentioned about the community savings bank, but maybe there could be local environmental bonds. So financing that's coming from major donors like the EU, maybe that could also be used to build regenerative local infrastructure and governance, and for communities to be able to access things like local environmental bonds or socially environmental bonds, because the war has had a massive impact on not only climate, but also you know, the local environment. So it's absolutely critical that communities can start to think about how to move towards nature positive enterprise as well, so that there is an interlocking of these positive benefits going forward. And there's a massive role as well for things like cooperatives and mutuals to support a more community impact economy. So that's essentially in that area. We all know that it's democracy is often something that is, you know, it's critical to peace, but it's also really important to kind of understand how a democratic governance of the economy can be accompanied in any kind of post-war reconstruction. So as I said, like mutuals are really positive because they are in themselves a kind of very equitable business model as well. So thinking about how the business recovery and the small and medium-sized enterprises, the voluntary community and social enterprise sector can work with a wider move towards participatory governance at a municipal and national level as well. And I really believe that ecological stewardship and community ownership is really kind of critical in that process as well. And there are lots of positive ways that you can integrate ecology into rebuilding the fabric of place. So whether that's through planning and reconstruction, or thinking about the environmental impacts that infrastructure has on recovery. So, you know, that there'll be lots of things like roads and buildings that will be built, but there's a massive environmental impact. And in the UK, I think, you know, we've quite pioneering because we have biodiversity net gain. And although it's, you know, not every policy is perfect, but I think it's a good principle in the fact that it's trying to encourage a positive 10% enhancement on the environment and biodiversity when development happens. So there are lots of wonderful things that are happening all over the place in terms of nature positive development and regenerative principles. So I think that's obviously important as well. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit, so I've got 2 more slides left, and this is just kind of the recommendation based on what I've said about regenerative value and the kind of the mechanisms and the incentives and how you measure that. I think that it's really important to kind of critically think about the word building back, and, you know, thinking about bouncing back, and you know, there's a difference between resilience and regeneration. And so it's kind of, you know, to what extent are there things that we want to go back to, and what extent are there things that need to be transformed or reconfigured. And I think that finance accompanies governance very, very, very closely, and they need to be brought together so that they are working in harmony. So for instance, when there is grant funding, or there is social impact investment, or any other type of investment, but the investment that is generated should lead to this kind of positive return across these multiple capitals or multiple dimensions of value. So it needs to not only just create jobs, but it needs to restore ecosystems, and it needs to strengthen communities, and it needs to build resilience or recovery or transformation and preserve culture. They're just some examples, but it's looking at the investment and the potential outcomes of investment from a multiple dimensional understanding of positive change, so that we don't get siloed thinking, and that we genuinely at scale can move towards something that is the positive tipping point, so that we can change the dynamics. And I know that there are huge wider forces at play as well, that it's not as easy as I'm trying to make out, and I know that, but I'm just saying that to create genuine systems change, the donors, the investors, everybody needs to kind of work towards this shared understanding of what regenerative reconstruction looks like. So yes, that is my my recommendation. And I just wanted to also, this is something, Vlad's seen this already, because he saw me present earlier in the year at Oxford University, but this is my poem about regenerative systems, and I just wanted to share it with you and encourage you to write your own poem as well, because I just think that poetry, songwriting, they're such wonderful tools to go deep within and think, how do I want to live my life? So let me read it to you. Regenerative systems are mindful and compassionate. They are respectful and authentic. They know and love your difference through genuine dialogue. They seek compassion and enable you in thriving places by holding a safe space in which to evolve healthy relationships. They are reciprocal, rewarding, and inspiring. They lead you to outcomes that are good for those around you and the natural systems upon which you depend. They support your higher purpose and the dreams you are meant to come true. They think before they consume, they mend and make do. They are playful and want you to create with them. And I know that it's probably not at all feeling like that in many, many parts of Ukraine. But it's a kind of, it's a poem for purposeful futures and how through a shared understanding and commitment that we can work towards what we want to achieve together. So just to kind of close off, I think that a regenerative approach to reconstruction could offer a roadmap for the rest of the world. And Ukraine has the opportunity to, with others, of course, as well, to kind of work towards this kind of possibility. But I also realize that I may have sounded like I've been talking like I'm living in a utopia, and I know very clearly that it's a lot harder than that. So when we are trying to build back better, or we are thinking to regenerate systems, we need to critically understand, what does a thriving community look like, and who's defining it, and why are they defining it? Do we have a shared vision of what a thriving community looks like? What resources are there? Who has access to them? Who defines who can access them? Who is shaping a response beyond a core group of people who are working towards a certain goal? How inclusive is it? Is building a community causing people to burn out? Are the active change makers working in overdrive and who's looking after them? So they're just some reality check questions of my own, just to kind of add to this. And I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that was useful.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Amy. Fantastic and quite emotional poem. I'm going to kick off with questions first, and then I'll share the floor with Lviv and people online. Two sort of things. One is more illustrative, because you mentioned some examples. We met during one of the workshops here in Oxford, where you and others presented quite a lot of examples of net zero kind of projects, and you've talked about various initiatives in the UK. What would be in your mind one of the most useful examples or illustrations for Ukraine, taking the lesson from the UK, from something that local communities have achieved so far? Sort of question number one. And the second question, probably broader and much more difficult, I think, is a bit question I've been posed. What are the necessary prerequisites, the conditions for this grand picture to actually be realized? Where would you start? What would be, building regenerative systems and regenerative resilience pillars? Where would you start if you were a minister for community building in Ukraine tomorrow? What would be your first most important priority? So 2 questions.
Thanks, Vlad. So as an example of net zero in the UK, we have a really great model of community energy. And I love the term community energy because it embodies not only actual energy infrastructure, but it's also the energy of community. And I think that second definition or understanding is often not necessarily applied to it, but it's a kind of wider definition that can kind of help. What is community energy? What does it enable? Where does it come from? What does it activate? And so thinking about these 2 understandings of community energy when thinking about energy infrastructure, I think is very important. And in the UK, it was supported, communities were able to raise finance from local investors or investors who wanted to fund energy infrastructure that was supported by community. So it wasn't kind of big utility companies. This was kind of community groups trying, they did a feasibility study for things like solar, in some cases hydro, so for renewable energy projects, and the government would basically incentivize with tax breaks the investment into these. projects. And because these community energy groups were set up mainly as community enterprises, they had an asset lock, which meant that they weren't profit driven, but if any profit that they generated was given back to the people who've invested or reinvested into the community. So these entities have been able to continue to invest the kind of funding and the profit from some of these energy projects back into their local community. And that's enabled them to think about community projects like that relate to sustainability or other wider infrastructure. So there's been a kind of asset lock mechanism that was supported by the government so that they attract investment in. Yes, some of that goes back to the shareholders, but there is the kind of guaranteed reinvestment in this regenerative value thinking that I've been talking about. And I think that's a great model. And the tax system, there was a particular tax break associated with that, and there was also the feed-in tariff. So it was the feed-in tariff basically was the way that you can get funds. It was a particular tariff that was paid to renewable energy, and it was set quite high to begin with, and then it dropped off. So there has been a change in what were quite generous incentives around the feed-in tariff and tax breaks on investment, which have kind of changed how sustainable community energy infrastructure when the investment is. But I think that's a really good model, and I encourage you to look into community energy. If I don't know how much you've got that in Ukraine already, but I think that's a really good thing. And in terms of where to start and the prerequisites, as I said, I think governance is really, really important as are the metrics. So I think understanding, almost like doing a kind of audit of, you know, who at different scales, who are our partners, what are the kind of where do we align, what's working well, what isn't working well, how are we actually, who's actually committed to this kind of thinking in our organizations or our communities. How can we find more ways to kind of partner with people who can bring this to life? So I think it's almost like a kind of an internal audit assessment of organizations and communities, and thinking like, well, you know, what resources do we have? What have we achieved? How can we partner better? What are the ways that we can enhance our governance to kind of think more regeneratively and have like critical questions at every meeting almost, and just kind of start small, just to kind of test, well, how far do we need to travel to actually get behind these ideas, and who's actually committed? Because, you know, there's no point in trying to just replicate something without understanding whether you're ready to replicate it. And that, I'm not talking about Ukraine, I'm talking about, you know, anywhere. So it's almost like a kind of, I would start within and a kind of organizational level to kind of sense check, rather than thinking in a really kind of grand policy way initially. That's what I would suggest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Amy. And before I pass back to the people in the audience, you might know, but Ukraine has, or you've mentioned as well, Ukraine has had quite a successful, though interrupted by the war, process of decentralization and devolution that has enabled financial resources to be returned and kept in local communities. Ukraine has always had quite a, actually, much more balanced central to local government relationship towards finance than say England. But the devolution to the decentralization reforms from 2019 onwards have enabled the communities to be more resilient when the actually occupation force came. And we've seen those examples of heroic mayors of those cities in southern eastern Ukraine who resisted the occupation. Some of them tragically lost their lives in that. But that was, I think, for me, that was a symbol of community resilience in a way that local democracy and also some financial power has actually produced quite incredible results, and I think we all hope that that will continue after the war. Do we have questions from the audience, please? I haven't seen anything. I don't see anything in the chat, but yeah, Hago, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and we can see you as well.
Great, thanks. Both Vlad and Amy, thanks a lot for interesting inputs. There was an interesting balance between the two, or contrast maybe. One very much into numbers, and the other one, although Amy, you also talked about KPIs or key performance indicators and measuring outcomes and so on. But anyway, my question is linked to well, measuring basically. And we've been, Amy, you talked quite a lot about value, and value is, you know, from a philosophical point of view, it's difficult to measure. And just for a quick introduction about myself, I'm an architect. I'm currently working in Ukraine with IOM, International Organization for Migration, and before that with UNHCR. But working with these projects where we are basically constructing housing for internally displaced, I've come across this dilemma in a way of what is value and what is $1 spent. Is $1 spent the same as $1 received? And I'm starting to think that no, it's not. $1 spent on communal housing is not the same as $1 spent on an individual house that you own yourself. And I was wondering whether any of you have thought about somehow, if it's possible to somehow have an indexing of value, whether you say, okay, $1 spent for the donor might mean something, but for on the beneficiary end, it can be more valuable than $1 or less valuable than $1. So my question is basically whether you have given any thought on the relativity of value in a way. Is it possible to have key performance indicators or measuring the outcomes? And you can always measure something, but how valuable is that measure in a way? Thanks.
Well, that's a simple question. Amy, would like to jump in?
Yes, I would like to say that I have been I've also been thinking about the deep philosophical question of what is value. So I've been working with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in the Civil Society and Youth team, looking at what, you know, the question of what is the value of the voluntary community and social enterprise sector for 15 months. So I'd love to have a further chat with you about that. But one of the things that I have been working on is a tool which is now going to lead into a follow-on project with the British Academy in the UK, which is looking around, is there a need for a kind of a value mapper that could quantify the shadow value of things that are not currently measured, and then also be related to kind of a wider taxonomy of different indicators and things like that. But in terms of like the difference of value and the relative value, I think that's a fascinating question. And if you want to, I mean, obviously that's something that you've kind of coined and shared, but if you wanted to work more closely with us on how to kind of embed that into the value mapping tool that we're going to create, and how that could be used, you know, more widely and maybe in your work, then I'd love to have a conversation about that.
Thanks. Interesting.
Yes, obviously the social sciences generally has been struggling with how to measure not just value, how to measure economy outside of GDP. Right? All my calculations based, of course, on official statistics within the concept of gross domestic product or gross national income. Yeah, measurable outputs in terms of monetary value at price. As I teach, of course, sustainable development, and Amy mentioned donut economics, there are a number of beyond GDP measurements and initiatives that want to value things very differently from dollar value or from monetary value. Donor economics has some measurements which are effectively trying to calculate the cost of consumption of natural resources, and they've kind of progressed through that quite significantly. On the beyond GDP calculations, I don't see that we have progressed that much. There's a lot of talks, there are a lot of books on beyond GDP calculations. There's happiness indicators. There are some things, but I haven't yet personally been convinced that we have progressed to the level that we can discard or add something at the same level of rigor that we have for GDP. I may be wrong, but haven't yet been convinced that we have an equally solid measure of value that value all the other things.
Can I jump in a bit as well? I mean, we have this buzz expression, build back better in Ukraine, and it's not just for Ukraine, but it's quite a common expression. But I find it very hard to find out what people actually mean by better. I mean, one is the net zero, which is maybe the topic of this session, but the better is very hard to actually identify, and it may mean completely different things for different people. So that's also something that I think we as an industry in a way should be a bit more conscious about. What is it actually we mean by better? Is it more employment, or is it just built-in environment that is reconstructed or whatever? But anyway, I'll leave it at that, and thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions as well in the audience. Amy, do you want to reflect more?
No, yeah, I was just going to say that, yeah, I completely agree. It's very, very subjective, and one person's definition is very different to another's. And also it's a policy to, the previous government and also the Biden administration used that phrase as well. And yes, it's not one without complexity.
Yeah, thanks so much. I wanted to comment from my side is that the presentation was great, and I think we learned another term which we could use, regeneration. I think we were not much using it for now in Ukraine. We had restoration, reconstruction, but of course regeneration is something new, and I think we will struggle with the translation of it definitely. In Ukrainian, I think it will be more like about energy, generatia or something like that. But still, yeah, the definition that you gave, actually what it means in the core, is very much appealing, I think, and important. I was really very much appreciating that you put environment also in, if not in the center, but in all your kind of slides and presentations. So thank you for that, because as an environmentalist, we always see, especially now, that environment is not, it's not the time, the proper time, it's expensive and so on. So thinking broader like that, including with all the social components where it can be beneficial, is very much important. And I think the interdisciplinarity of the regeneration is huge. That's why my question would be, who are actually your allies in UK with whom you cooperate to move this this whole work? Because it is economic, social, psychological, everything all in one. And we are usually working in the bubbles. How to get out and how to find allies? Thank you.
So it's been a lifelong goal of mine to try and bring the social, the environmental, and the political / governance into one harmonized framework, because even in some of the work that I've been doing in trying to bring it together, it's quite a kind of, there's a social value silo, or there's a kind of environmental biodiversity finance silo, or there's understanding small and medium-sized enterprises on the one hand, and then voluntary and community organizations on the other hand, without understanding that actually you can have a purposeful business that acts like a kind of community venture, and they're all interrelated, but there's still a lot of work needing to bring some of these silos together. But it's work that's definitely in motion, I'm trying to do what I can in the work that I'm doing. But in terms of the nature positive side of stuff, so nature positive was a phrase that was coined. I think it's Nature Positive 2030, if you look it up, and then there's been lots and lots of research on integrating biodiversity into financial systems. So in the UK in 2021, we had the Dasgupta review, which was looking about the economics of biodiversity. And the government's been really supportive of this kind of nature positive policy goal. How it's actually translating in practice, there's always a kind of the difference between high level policy goals and how it gets implemented. But there's a lot of traction because there's the Task Force for Nature Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, that is pushing the nature positive finance agenda globally. They've developed a framework with different indicators and approaches, mainly geared at investors, but also for different sectors, how you can kind of start to quantify the dependencies that different sectors have on nature and how that should be considered in financial decisions. So, when grant financing or any kind of financing is happening, ideally at a global scale, these kind of principles need to start becoming embedded. And there is a lot of work that's being done. But in the UK, you asked about who the allies are. It's a research council funded project. We've got SME Nature Positive Finance is one of our projects. It's funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, and they have funded the Integrating Finance and Biodiversity Programme, which has got two strands. It's kind of looking at the economics of biodiversity and then how to integrate finance and biodiversity. And we've got lots and lots of projects which are kind of tackling this issue from lots of different angles. So there's a real groundswell of interest and drive to encourage biodiversity to become part of investment decision making. But still, I feel that there's a lot of room for the social impact investment landscape to work with this effort, because I still feel that they're not quite together yet, and they need to be. So in terms of impact investing, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport does lots and lots of work around social investment. So that's the real kind of in terms of the government department. But there's a whole load of wonderful organisations that I could link you up to if you're interested in some kind of knowledge exchange on these topics.
Thank you. We have two more questions, so we will try to be quick.
Thank you so much. I'll be in Ukrainian. Я Марія Лук'янова, програма
This program, Vlad and Amy, thank you very much for inspiring presentation and deep dive into green investments and green recovery. And I want to pay your attention that within the last year, it is so fast in Ukraine. A year ago, it was advocacy for integrating our communities, gromadas, and today they are already making action plans, and it is in the context of green investment. And thank you very much, Amy, for telling that we should develop additional sources of funding, including general green bonds, blended finance. And my question is the following. Gromadas have a challenge when they are forming the action plan, and they sometimes don't understand where to take money for the project they have already planned, and they don't see this money in their budget. I mean, the projects without grants. Could you recommend some instrument which would help our gromadas communities to be more resilient? It seems to me that there are many innovation cases of funding communities in EU countries, the countries which entered the EU in 2004 and later. But in Ukraine, there are also interesting initiatives. But well, there is some experience in Poland, Hungary, Romania, in Baltic states, where you might find some good examples of such investments projects. The main tendency will be when Ukraine enters the EU, regional funds and cohesion policy will come to Ukraine, and all these mechanisms of co-funding of local gromadas, 25-75, 50-50, they will come gradually to Ukraine and will become the main topic of Ukraine's regional development. EU entry of Ukraine will gradually change Ukraine's legislation, relationship between central authorities and regional authorities. And so cohesion policy of the EU, when the EU supports poor regions of Eastern Europe.
During the day after your session, myself and Maria will be moderating a panel. So if you have time, you could join. And we have one more question.
Hi, my name is Dr. Helena Tripolska. I'm an economist, not an environmental scientist, and sadly, I do not know much about the environment. But I know just a little bit about the adaptation, and I don't have really a question, but a quick comment. There are many initiatives which aim to, I don't know, deal somehow with climate change and adaptation, and there are many initiatives on the ground. And like on the level of the government, Ukraine is doing its best to implement what is required from us by our international partners. So my kind of subjective observation, since Ukraine is striving to join the European Union, and our like dear European partners softly push us to implement things which indirectly are related to the environment in general and climate change in particular. So and this is, I think, like on the first glance, we live in war, and maybe this is not like the immediate priority. But when we think about it, it's this kind of push is a good thing, because, for instance, we know that, let's say, all the policy documents regarding the energy, they already require climate and adaptation sections, and this is a good thing. So. For Ukraine as a country in general, it means kind of a double task. First of all, it has to fight for its survival, physical and mental and on other senses, but also in parallel, Ukraine has to deal with all these environmental and adaptational issues. The task is very difficult and challenging, but looks like it's doable because there is no other choice. So this is just like thinking loud from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. Amy would like to say something about that, given that you are much more environmentally aligned.
I'm afraid there's some background noise which is rather distracting my thinking. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't hear no worries.
Yeah, thanks to all people in the audience for the reflections. I'm glad a healthy dose of number crunching and poetry mixed together has produced some discussions here. I want to move on to the final part of today's session now, and we decided to invest as much time in the first two parts because I think it's quite important for us not just to present our thoughts, but also to hear the audience in live and online. And I think we've had so far quite a useful discussion on these topics. I'm going to move on to the final part, which is a case study of potentially Zoom problem. Sorry. Kind of lost. Yeah. Okay. Right. We're here. Right. So this is a kind of a case study that I hope will also inspire people in the audience, and is also a quite well costed feasibility study for, I think, an amazing opportunity that Ukraine have after the war. We've already mentioned the amount of damage that the war has created so far, the billions and billions of loss, of course, the thousands and thousands of human loss, and a huge part of destruction has affected the old industrial regions in eastern Ukraine, and of course we all remember those images when Mariupol was encircled and bombarded heavily in 2022, and the images of Azovstal steel plant, we've seen across the world. So the old industrial assets have been affected quite dramatically during the war, and I think here there is a real opportunity for us to think about building back better, and exactly responding to Amy's and the audience's questions about what is better. I think I'm going to talk about one particular opportunity for doing just that. I'm going to focus on Ukrainian iron and steel industry and how a clean energy transformation of it can create not just a sustainable industry going forward, but also, again, using the multiplier effects, quite a significant economic boost to the economy itself. The Ukrainian steel industry, before the large-scale invasion, was number 14 in the world, producing almost 22 million tons of steel. Large chunk of that output was exported. It was the most exported commodity of Ukraine of every year since independence. So from 1991 till 2021, basic metals were number one commodity of Ukrainian exports. So it is an it's been an incredibly important industry in terms of its foreign currency generation of value. It added about 2.3% to Ukrainian economy, and it was about 15% of Ukrainian industrial output. And in 2021, steel companies paid almost $4 billion in taxes to the Ukrainian budget. So it's an incredibly important industry. But of course, as we all know, to produce steel, traditionally, you need to have a particular type of fuel to melt the iron ore, which is the core raw material of which, after several processes of melting and remelting, we get to the steel kind of raw steel, virgin steel production, which then is used for making everything around us. And of course, steel is the most important engineering construction material in the world, and most of the things are based on it. If you look at this particular graph, you will see a lot of burning, and traditionally we still use coal for effectively creating a fuel, which is called coke, for melting iron ore, and then producing steel out of it. So it is an incredibly CO2 polluting industry. It produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a problem, which is a massive problem. In Ukraine, as you can see, the coal production and steel production has been increasingly linked. Ukrainian steel production peaked in 1986 at almost 57 million tons. There was a massive dip during the post-communist transition. Then last peak of 2007 of 42.8 billion tons. And as I said, before the large-scale invasion, production was kind of averaging 22 million tons a year. Now, what needs to happen for us to move away from using coal and coke in blast furnaces for the production of steel is to find another type of fuel which is not CO2 emitting. Current averages in the world, in a normal traditional coal-based production process, a ton of steel equals 2.4 tons of CO2. The alternatives available are using electricity for melting and smelting recycled second-hand kind of steel. Those are better figures, 0.7 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. However, the currently available system for using scrap metal in electric arc furnaces, that's EAF, the temperature in the furnace itself cannot reach the 1,600 degrees centigrade that is necessary for melting the actual iron from the ore. So the current electric arc furnace infrastructure allows you to use scrap metal, but it doesn't allow you to use the raw material of iron ore, which is needed for producing so-called virgin steel, which is needed for producing high quality steel. So we need something else. And there are a number of alternatives available, and the most lowest carbon emitting alternative is to use renewable energy through the production of green hydrogen, which is used to melt the iron and to produce virgin steel from iron ore. So the currently the most discussed process in the world in terms of how to produce and restructure iron and steel industry is to produce hydrogen, which is a fuel that can reach the necessary 1,600 degrees centigrade, that can be used directly to melt iron ore to produce steel. But the problem with hydrogen is that it does not really exist as a natural resource. It is very volatile. It's not really easily to find it and mine it or to extract it from somewhere on the planet. And so the available alternatives so far that have been tried and tested still use quite a lot of fossil fuels, especially natural gas, to produce hydrogen out of it. And of course, natural gas is better than coal and oil, and yet it is still not really a renewable energy source. And hence, for the real green steel production, what is necessary to happen is that we need to have green hydrogen, which needs to be produced with green electricity and water. And that will allow us to move really to the net zero, to the lowest low emissions or green steel. And of course, the main roadblock, of course, is to find enough electricity or to build enough renewable energy capacity to produce enough green hydrogen for steel production. Ukraine has a potential to optimize its availability of local iron ore resources, of which there are quite plenty, and also to optimize its ability of building renewable energy using the natural environment that it has. So we've been working with a number of colleagues, and I was only a smaller part of this big project. Engineers, of course, run our project. We've looked at those opportunities, how we can actually restructure the industry, how much it would cost to build enough renewable energy capacity to produce enough green hydrogen, to then produce enough green steel to keep the production levels at least at the pre-war level and potentially to grow further. So this is building on the work of Oleksandr Devlin, who was a DPhil researcher here at Oxford, and her colleagues from Department of Engineering, who crunched all the numbers using a particularly sophisticated model. They used existing assets data. They've used the most pioneering part, of course, is to produce a map of potential renewable energy spots where you could put renewable energy, the wind power and solar power installations in place to start producing enough renewable energy, so then to put it into production of green hydrogen for steel production. So our project, which lasted several years, at least more than a year, used renewable energy potential mapping of Ukraine, used existing assets data to find out where the current assets are, because you would want to reuse your blast furnace kind of assets, your existing steel mills for green steel production. The model itself also have chemical process data, economic data, geospatial data, hydro and nuclear power potential data, and then using those inputs, we've looked at actually availability of land and where the green steel plants could be built for the future after the war. This is an example of a map at 1.1 degree grid spatial resolution, about 111 kilometers by 73 kilometers, and the map itself shows you the average price for the renewable energy production in Ukraine. The darker spots are the most expensive renewable energy, at reaching $90 per megawatt hours. The lightest ones at about $60 per megawatt hours. This is the spots where renewable energy potential, onshore renewable energy potential for combined solar and wind installations is. And this is where you could probably think of putting combined solar and wind energy spots in Ukraine. This is the map of where potential green hydrogen can be produced at a particular cost, ranging from $3 per kilogram of hydrogen to $6.50 of kilograms. And you can see that the northernmost and kind of southernmost part of Ukraine are where they would be the cheapest place to produce those things. And this is the synthetic, the overall kind of map of continuous production of ammonia. Ammonia is a chemical component that effectively can be transported easily, unlike hydrogen, which cannot be transported easily. So to transport hydrogen, you will have to turn it into ammonia and then turn it back. So for transportation of hydrogen from a cheap location to where you would want the green steel to be actually produced, you will need to then crack it, as I said, into ammonia, which is NH3, and then back into hydrogen at the production site as well. We've also looked at the offshore potential as well, and mapping those assets. We've looked at the locations of the significant iron ore reserves in Ukraine. We've looked at the potential, obviously, renewable energy places where the most optimal locations of those the wind power and solar power will be. And also we positioned the industry as, of course, continuously been export oriented towards the EU, and in anticipation of Ukraine's entry into the EU, and also in recognizing that in 2030, and starting from now, but in 2030, all steel produced in the EU or all steel imported to the EU will be taxed at its carbon intensity levels. So Ukrainian steel industry will have to go green, because it will not be able actually to export steel at profitable levels to the EU, because the taxes on carbon will be increasingly high and high. We've looked at two different scenarios of Ukrainian post-war reconstruction. One, a kind of slow recovery in which most people do not return to Ukraine. The demand is lower, the EU accession is slower, and also the Ukrainian territories are not liberated fully. And we looked at another scenario where we have full liberation, strong recovery, most people return, and higher types of demand on things. In any of these scenarios, green growth is underpinned by a strong regional demand and creating competitive products in the end. And so we've been looking at a number of quite difficult and sophisticated calculations, and effectively looking at the ways where the export outlays, the export channels will which are the most used, and in Ukrainian case, ports of course are used for exporting bulky items like steel through the Black Sea towards Mediterranean kind of ports, and then railways are used in Ukraine for exporting a lot of stuff through Poland or through other Eastern European countries to the kind of more Western and Northern European routes. So we're looking at those two potential routes, seaports in the south and railway hubs on the Ukrainian-Polish border, as another kind of part of this puzzle. Now, moving on. So this is the scenario in which the currently occupied territories continue to be occupied by the Russians, and this is the scenario in which we have slow recovery and slower demand, and we are looking at an industry that is producing about 15 million tons of green steel per year by 2050. The total cost of creating renewable energy sites and reconfiguring the steel production process amounts to about $29 billion. And what you see on the map on the left is the location of green steel plants that either will be built from scratch, like all of those in sort of central and northwestern part of Ukraine, and also in southern part of Ukraine, but some of them will be using the Kryvyi Rih assets that already been used now for production of traditional steel. So this is the map of Green Steel Ukraine 2050 under this particular scenario, and this is where the location, the optimal locations for putting those plants in, according to all these calculations of distance, of cost, of bulk, of renewable energy locations. So those are the best places to put green steel plants during the reconstruction. The beauty of the process is that using multiplier effects, we can say that rebuilding or building a new green steel industry will create much bigger economic output effect. The multiplier for economic growth using rebuilding Ukrainian industry of 29 billion of investment will get us potentially almost 10 times as much of economic growth, to $187 billion. And if we just build back the existing coal steel facilities, the GVA multiplier will be only 155 billion. So actually going green, even in the slow recovery, partly occupied scenario of a 20-year lifetime, will give us still quite an incredible boost to economic growth. And of course, it will lead us to have a product that can be exported to the EU without being taxed. Tariffs, right? Carbon tariffs will not apply because it will be a green production. If we have a scenario in which Ukraine is fully liberated, Most people recover soon. Ukraine enters the EU by 2030. Over a 20-year period of time, it can easily rebuild its 22.5 million ton steel capacity, and the total cost of that will be $62 billion. And the map of that scenario and where the green steel plants should be built is in front of you on the left. You see it's kind of a somewhat different map, right? Because you can see how kind of southern Ukraine obviously is much more attractive given the renewable energy potential of southern Ukraine. Southern Ukraine is quite high. In any eventuality, this scenario also have quite much higher green economic growth potential than if we just rebuild the whole industry using coal-based traditional methods. So kind of concluding this story is that we have quite a significant potential for building back better. And here better means actually a totally new industry that does not generate a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, that produces a product that will be easily exportable to foreign markets as well. The costs are between $29 billion to $62 billion overall. But the most important probably point to highlight is that the bulk of that money will go for renewable energy infrastructure. So the bulk of that money needs to be for building combined solar and wind power plants across Ukraine and for energy storage of it. And only a small part of this big bill will be for actual iron and steel making furnaces and iron and steel making facilities themselves. So even if we don't need, even if you think, well, iron and steel industry is not important for us, energy is important for us, right? And especially now, as Ukraine is having the highest electricity costs in the world, or at least in the known world, these sites, these locations for renewable energy are actually useful in themselves, even if we disregard the steel industry. But of course, steel industry, as I said, is an incredibly important driver of growth. It is strategic industry. It has been supporting our national prosperity for many years and has to continue to be used because iron ore reserves are in Ukraine. So I'm going to just highlight the challenges, and then we move on to questions. We are slightly moving into the tea break, but just to say the timing is critical for this. Of course, we have labor shortages, and I know people will already ask about labor shortages. That is a big problem. Obviously, the war needs to end, and we need to have political economic stability for this investment. That is for sure. The main priority, I would argue, is the renewable energy itself, and investment into that as a first step towards the greener future. The results of the research have been published in the Journal of Cleaner Production as an academic paper, including a 73-page appendix with maps, with all the calculations of every types of things you can imagine. We are popularizing this research through a variety of industrial conferences, publishing it in various industrial magazines, just to highlight to the steel industry that this potential exists. And finally, I'm pleased to say we managed to translate the paper into Ukrainian, and it just been published in Вісник економічної науки України this year in full with all the authors. And I would like to thank Alexander Devlin and Anastasia Zagoruychik and Nicola Salmon and Miroslava Soldak, my co-authors who've done this work. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we'll have time for a few questions.
Thank you so much, Vlad. We have a question in the audience.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. Despite I know some people from the authors, but the study that you have conducted, I would like to say that before the war, Ukraine used to have a couple of projects, actually several projects that focus on not so much on the production of green ammonia, but on the studies of chemical properties of green ammonia, of possibility of it blending with natural gas, studies of the properties of the pipe, I mean the general gas transmission, transportation properties and so on. Because like we know that roughly speaking, half of the pipe is very old and green hydrogen is very volatile, so basically it's unfeasible to transport it other than in liquid form. Many of the studies they were around Sumy region. Sumy is like not the best region in terms of economic development and the proximity to Russia. Yes, and because of the war, obviously these studies have stopped, which is very unfortunate. Ukraine also in parallel is trying to develop renewable energy, but we kind of facing significant difficulties in balancing the grid and in many other issues. Ukrenergo, the transmission system, the TSO does a wonderful job and does its best to have the Ukraine would have electricity, but there are so many difficulties that are very, let's say, challenging to tackle. Also investment in the renewables require lots of money to be invested, which is kind of not very easy in terms of the full-scale invasion. So my question is, did you consider the pink hydrogen for the study? And do you think is it possible, the one produced from nuclear?
Yes, I can see Vladlena telling me to wrap up. Sorry for being overrunning this a little bit. We've considered in the actual paper itself, and especially in the appendix, you will see all the scenarios for moving to, well, the ultimate one is green hydrogen production, right, based on ammonia. But also we've used a number of calculations for a mix of, well, gas, nuclear, hydro. So we have different scenarios, different calculations of the mix, the energy mix for the production of steel itself. So the calculations of all types of these mixes per ton of steel is an appendix, and it's probably the most accurate the available data that we have. So we've looked at we haven't looked at pink, we look at green as first, but also at kind of gray hydrogen as well options to see whether that is a transition process, right? It's a transition mechanism to move on. So I do recommend people who are interested in it, look at the paper itself and also look at the appendix, because there's an enormous amount of calculations and data is there for everybody to see. I need to say that, you know, our 29 billion price tag for a 15 million ton green steel production is extremely similar to what ArcelorMittal and Metinvest put forward in 2022. Their calculation was 35 billion to produce 15 million ton of green steel. Our calculation is 29 billion to produce 15 million green steel. So actually, I think our academic calculations and industry calculations are quite well aligned, and hence it gives me hope that our calculations and all the stuff in the papers itself is actually quite valuable and probably the best estimate that is possible to produce at the moment. So I do encourage everyone to look at it. The paper has been translated in Ukrainian for people, you know, to spread it in Ukraine a bit more widely, and I'm really glad that we have created quite a lot of interest so far. Vladlena, I'm wrapping up. Fantastic conversation. Thanks a lot, everyone, for tuning up to the Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, rebuilding back better session. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and we all deserve a little break.
Thank you so much. It was a great start for our future today's conversations. And you can still remain, I think, online if you're interested. I know it's Saturday. Dobre.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.